Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fifth installment of In Conversation with a Survivor speaker series. I am Emily, educator with Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. Before we get started this afternoon, I want to take a moment to remind viewers to keep their videos off and their mics muted, as this presentation will be recorded and circulated later this week. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to send them at your leisure in the chat box throughout, and they'll be coming through to our staff. Depending on timing, we'll do our best to address as many of those questions as possible, but please do not unmute yourself to ask any questions, as it can be very disruptive. Today, I am joined by Judith Avitan, Executive Director of the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, Michael Levitt, CEO of FSWC, and of course, our wonderful guest speaker for the event, Andy Reti. Hi, Andy. To begin, Judith will be offering some opening remarks in just a moment. Judith has been the Executive Director for the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights since its inception in 2015. Prior to joining the Raoul Wallenberg Centre, Judith served as the Chief of Staff to the Honourable Irwin Cotler, former Member of Parliament and Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, who now chairs the Centre. She has also served as a foreign law clerk to the President and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Israel and headed the parliamentary office of the Honourable Irwin Cotler when he was Liberal Justice and Human Rights critic. Her work has included extensive research and policy analysis, and she has devoted special attention to issues of international justice and political prisoner cases. Judith, welcome.
Thank you, Emily, for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. The Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights is pleased to partner with the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies on this critical biweekly In Conversation with a Survivor speaker series. I would also like to commend the great team at the Simon Wiesenthal Center who have put together the speaker series. These testimonies provide an important contribution not only to historical truth, but to the preservation of memory. I am delighted that today's speaker is Andy Reti. His presentation and story of survival called The Ring of Love, which he refers to as a love story, is also a testament to the powerful bond between mother and child. I look forward with all of you to listening to his moving and compelling remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those kind words. We appreciate you joining us this afternoon and reaffirming Raoul Wallenberg Center's partnership with FSWC with this very successful speaker series programming. In these challenging times, the testimony from survivors reminds us of the resilience of humanity during even the darkest hours of this history. Andy Reti is one of the first survivors that I had the pleasure of working with when I started FSWC, and even today I am reminded by his innate ability to light up a room, even a virtual one. Andy was born in 1942 in Budapest and spent the earliest years of his life in the Jewish ghetto there, which was put in place during the Nazi occupation of the region. Andy's story is very unique, as all of them are, as it is just as much his story as it is his mother's, Ibi. While some of his earliest recollections are from his months living and surviving the ghetto, much of his testimony was knowledge passed on from his mother in the years after liberation. Andy's story is a keen reminder of the millions of Jewish children who were intimately affected by the violence and anti-Semitism taking place around them during the war years, but also the pain and uncertainty of the events following the end of the war in 1945. Today, Andy shares his story and his mother's story with students of all ages in hopes that they better understand the responsibilities of the world they've inherited. Andy, we welcome you to the floor.
Shalom, good afternoon, and thank you for those incredible introductions. Indeed, my presentation is called The Ring of Love. I am wearing that ring of love, and in a minute you'll be able to see the picture. However, as Judith referenced, I have been in Holocaust education for 22 years. This is my 22nd year. I had the pleasure of working with my mother and a number of other survivors, all connected with the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. And after being a docent, which is museum educator, I came to the conclusion that every Holocaust survivor story is a love story. It's love of life, love of family, and love of freedom. And in the next 40 minutes, I will try to connect those incredible human emotions to all of you. So after Emily's introduction, let's get right into it. Next slide. You can't see this, but this is a poster of my mother, and it says in her own handwriting that I was very bitter for many long years, but you can't live with hatred in your heart all the time. But to forget, I can't. And I can't forgive it either. The hurt deep in my heart will stay with me till the day I die. She died a very young 88. She died the way she lived, with incredible courage, with incredible determination. So I also usually thank my audience, which is mostly students. This is the first time I'm doing it for such a large Zoom audience, and I like to interact with my audience. And I do say that thank you for coming, and thank you for helping me to honor my mother. So that is really the beginning of my presentation. Next, please. You see the ring of love, which I'm wearing, but in reality, the original is a very tiny, tiny, small ring. And you will see that she has it on her necklace together with the symbol of high, which is meaning life, 18. It's a symbol of Ket and Yud, signifying 18, which I will incredibly will relate to my and my mother's survival, because we indeed lived, and the number 18 was a recurring theme. Next, please. My parents came from very ordinary poor families. They married in 1939, which of course was the beginning of the Second World War, or the Holocaust, and our tragedy. My mother was very much in love with this incredible man. And in those days, the practice was that if you got engaged, you put your wedding band on your right hand. And then when you got married, you just moved it to the left hand. Or the vogue today, the fashion today is to get expensive, big engagement diamond rings. Well, they couldn't afford it anyway, and it wasn't in fashion yet. So this ring has an incredible story behind it. Next, please. My two sets of grandparents, the one on the right, my paternal grandparents with whom I lived all my life, and my maternal grandparents that I never knew, but fortunately they knew me. Because we lived in the capital of Budapest, we were the last to be rounded up. My maternal grandparents lived in a rural area. They were the first, and they were taken directly to Auschwitz. Because we lived in the capital and the entire Jewish population was relatively intact, I can tell you that our Shoah, which is my preferred word, versus Holocaust, started in the spring and summer of 1944. Hungary at the time was an ally of Germany. The governor or the leader of Hungary, for the very longest of time, tried not to join the Nazis, but in the end, he was forced out of power. And in October of 1944, the Hungarian Nazi party called Nyilas took over. Horthy was pushed out of power, and the following day, October 16, is when our story begins. Next, please. Age 31, in the prime of his life, 5'10", a swimming instructor, second generation swimming instructor, and the love of his life, 5'0", and the love of their product. I was declared by a little madman, whose name I very seldom mention, that I was ein Leben nicht wertig, a life not worthwhile living. Well, today I'm 78 years old, and I can tell you that my life was, is, and hope to continue to be worthwhile living. Who was this little madman? Who was able to make followers? Who was able to convert people's rational thinking to become murderers? And that's what really and truly is behind all this. Followers, people who did not think for themselves, but thankfully, fortunately, there were people who did. So it's just an incredible coincidence that the co-presentation today is by the Raoul Wallenberg Society. And we never could prove it with certainty, but it's fairly sure or reasonably sure that we owe our lives. I owe my life to this incredible upstander, Raoul Wallenberg. Usually, as I said, I speak to students, and at this time I would say, look it up, make an assignment out of it, research who Raoul Wallenberg was and what he did. Now, interestingly, the two ladies who introduced my story kind of threw me off track, because I always make it a point when I say that thank you for helping to honor my mother, to make sure that it is understood up front that this is our story. It is my mother's mostly, but mine as well, because I was there with her. My mother was an incredible woman. She had unbelievable foresight and prescience, and there is no doubt in my mind that I owe my life to my two incredible women in my life, my mother and grandmother. Next slide, please. Now, usually I start by saying when I was born, which was 1942, and I do make it a point to let it be known that I was born as Reknitzer András. We changed the name from Reknitzer to Reti after liberation when I was about 3 years old. And we changed it because we didn't want to stand out as Jews. Sadly, it never helped. A lot of people changed their names, but it didn't help, because the maniacs were going to go and kill the Jews no matter what. They were so intent on murder. There was so much hatred in their heart that nothing helped. Recknitz is in today's Austria, but during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the border shifting all the time. Sometimes it was in Hungary, sometimes it was in Austria. Hungary called it Rohonc, Austria called it Recknitz, hence Recknitzer, meaning the villager. Now you have a picture of my wonderful wife, Judy, who is my second wife. We've been together now for 20 years, also daughter of Holocaust survivors, and an incredibly beautiful picture of the countryside. We're standing in front of a brick factory wall, and just in front of us, there is an outdoor exhibit, because believe it or not, my friends, even after liberation, after 1945, they were still murdering Jews in that place because the hatred ran so deep. At times like this, I usually ask the question from my young audience, well, what is the opposite to hate? And of course, it's love. And what is the opposite to love? It's hate. But our namesake came up with another description. It's indifference. Think about it. If you're indifferent, you neither hate or love, what are you? What kind of a human being are you? In fact, why is a bystander versus being an upstander? But that's what it was. It was people who stood back and did nothing. Next, please. This is what I was. A lot of people who've been to Europe or are from Europe are familiar with this type of construction, which is all over Europe. It's two courtyards, open air atrium, open courtyards, This one had a twin to it. Some of them even have a third one. In other words, it's three buildings kind of attached to each other. At the entrance, where you can see a few people standing in the entrance, there is a small tunnel. And when you come at the other end of the tunnel, the first apartment you see is our apartment. This one here. Oh, sorry, you can't see it. This was the first apartment that you would come into when anybody comes into the building. So October 16, the Nazis take over. Same day, young thugs with guns come and order everybody out within 5 minutes and to carry with them only what they could. My mother naturally had to carry me and a little knapsack and ask my grandmother, no matter what happens, to follow her, to follow us. Well, this really and truly was incredible foresight because as to what happened. The weather in Hungary is really similar to what we have here in Canada. October can be damp, rainy, and we were ordered out of the building. Up to 70% of the population in all these buildings were Jewish. In fact, we lived in the heart of the Jewish district. To this day, we have a tendency, I mean, that's human nature. You like to be with your own kind. But I personally have always lived in the Jewish area. To this day, I still live at Bathurst and Shepherd in North York, Toronto, which is pretty well a heavily populated Jewish area. So about 70% of the residents were Jewish. So you can imagine that as we are rounded up, people who were our friends and neighbors were clapping and cheering and spitting on us as we were led away. How do people behave like this? What makes them? But this was only the beginning. Next is really and truly the beginning of my love story. My mother, as I said, came from a very poor family, and she was so in love with that incredible man that when we were forced out of our apartment and made to march down the street, in no time at all, thousands of people were marching down the street. In about 15 minutes, the entire process was stopped, halt, a blanket was put down on the ground, and every piece of jewelry that you had on you had to be handed over. My mother was so determined not to give over her precious wedding band that she decided, and this is at times I challenged my young audience to guess where it is, but this is a Zoo audience, so I'll tell you, she hid it in the baby's diaper. In some corners, it is thought that if you touch poo-poo, caca, manure, it brings you good luck. So I'll show you that this ring had indeed brought its share of good luck. But rather for me to continue, I'm going to let you listen to my mother's own word to describe what happened.
We had to go out front of the house and form a line, 5 of us. And as I said, I just grabbed the knapsack, which there are a little tea or crackers or apple and things for the baby. And I grabbed one blanket and we went out. At that time, my father-in-law was still home. On the street, if I was not there, I would not believe what the people did to us. All those people from the neighboring house, the hairdresser whom I went every 2 weeks, they all lined up on the sidewalk. They were happy. They were spot on us. They said ugly words. They grabbed anything they could. One smashed my father-in-law's eyeglasses. The other took off a coat from a man's shoulder. The other one grabbed out the blanket from my hand. And there is only one voice among the thousands and thousands of onlookers who said, "Can't you see this is for a baby? Give it back." But of course, I was not allowed to even look back, not to wait for the blanket. And I was wondering, who could be that one person who spoke up?
One person who spoke up. The upstander instead of the bystander. It is human nature. It is within our genetic makeup to fight or flight, to stand up or to run away. Most people, when there is confrontation, their tendency is, I want nothing to do with it. I don't want to see it. I don't want to hear it. But people like Raoul Wallenberg were not like that. People like Raoul Wallenberg had a conscience, as my mother used to say, they had a heart in the cavity rather than a rock that a lot of them had. Now, as I mentioned to you, this is 22 years that I've been doing it. I heard everybody's stories, most everybody. And there are a couple of common denominators. One of them is, which is the most important and most prevalent, without fail, every survivor owes their life to at least one, sometimes several upstanders, the righteous, the people who could not stand by and watch this happening. We were no exception. We had a couple of miracles that happened. Now, believe it or not, I was only 2.5 years old when we were liberated, but I do have two personal recollections from the Holocaust, which I'm going to include. However, let me just tell you that it was a miracle after miracle that we survived. So we're rounded up, we're robbed, and we are taken to an unknown destination. We had no idea where we're going to end up. Well, actually, we ended up in an open air racetrack, and in no time at all, tens of thousands of 100,000 people perhaps were made to go and stand in this infield because there were no facilities, there was no coverage. We were out in the open and it was dark and damp and cold. This is when the first miracle happened. My grandmother recognized a young policeman from her hometown, and she went over to him and begged for help. Now, imagine, a police force is based on following orders. This young policeman could easily have said, I don't know you, I want nothing to do with you, step back into the line. But this policeman had the heart in its right place. He said, you see that group over there? Make sure you don't get mixed up with them, because by that time we knew what he meant when he said that group is going to go to Auschwitz. So by one miracle after another, we were able to avoid getting put into that group. So we get back in line, and my mother naturally had her number one job is to look after me. In no time at all, an order comes for mothers who have babies under 2 years of age to put the baby down and walk away from it. Can you imagine this kind of cruelty? Well, this was the second miracle, because my grandmother was able to pick me up and take me away. But my friends, right then and there were a lot of young kids who were trampled, even trampled to death, because they didn't have anybody to take care of them. So as I said, every story has one miracle or many miracles. So my grandmother picked me up. My mother was able to rejoin us, and we're there October 16, 17, 3 o'clock in the morning on October 18, remember? High 18, The light comes on, the microphone comes on and says, you can all go home now. Well, you can imagine the relief and the elation and the happiness. But for some people, it was a very short-lived happiness, because as we are walking away, the Nazis were shooting at us and people on either side of us were murdered, but we survived. Another miracle. So what do we do? Well, what do? We go home, the only place we know. Well, we went home, but our freedom was short-lived. In 2 days' time, we rounded up again, same procedure, but by this time there was nothing left except the ring, which again she hid. And this time we're taken to a brick factory where we're sorted and we're taken to a ghetto. The address of the ghetto was 9 Acacia Street. As I put this story together, I came upon the realization how the 18 and the 9 were a recurring theme. Well, 9 Acacia Street, Health for Life, we're so far so good, we're alive. Well, you can imagine. It was an identical building as to what I had shown you, but a different address. 30 people were crammed into a 2-room apartment. That was 2 rooms. That was a small wood-burning facility, a wood-burning stove. The washroom was down the hall, a common washroom. 30 people, 7 of them children under the age of 7. We were lucky, we were one of the first ones to have been taken there. And my mother was together with her best friend who had a baby a few months older than me. As you can see, these 2 kids, blonde, blue-eyed, they don't look Jewish. Well, they were, and they were supposed to be murdered. In fact, my little friend Katie, after whom I named my daughter, is my first personal recollection of the Holocaust. Because when we got into this apartment building, as I said, we were the first ones, and my mother, together with her friend, whose husband coincidentally was also in the same unit as my father, which I didn't find out for years and years and years. In fact, I didn't find out my father's story for many, many long years. So my mother and her friend Muncie, her baby Cutty, and me were able to commandeer and fold out Chesterfield, and the 2 mothers were on the outside of on the fold-out couch, and the 2 babies were inside sleeping toe to toe. And my little friend Katie had the coldest feet in the universe. To this day, when my wife touches me with her cold feet, I jump. It's in me, I can't help it. My dear wife of 32 years, who was survivor of Auschwitz, passed away at age 53, had cold feet. She put her feet against me, I jumped. Judy makes me jump. Sometimes deliberately, sometimes good-naturedly, but I jump. That is my own recollection of the ghetto, with another one that I'll share with you in a minute. So what do you do in a ghetto? I usually ask kids when I speak to younger audiences, how many of you have siblings under 5 years of age? And a good third of them will say. So I ask, what do you do when you have to babysit? Oh, we watch TV, we play games, and very seldom, occasionally, one will say, I'll read. I said, wonderful, because there was no television, there were no electronics, there were no games in the ghetto. The only thing you could say and do is read or tell a story. Then I will challenge my young audience to say, does it happen that when you read a story to a child, when you finished, what will they say? Read it again. And heaven help you if you leave out one word, because sometimes they know it better than you do. But people, children, like to hear stories. This is one of the things that we as human beings have in common. So to keep the children from thinking of hunger, there wasn't much to do. The gates of the ghetto were shut at the end of October, and nobody in or out except the dead. At the beginning, we had enough food, but later on, it was getting less and less and less. In fact, it was so bad that at the end, literally, people were just dreaming of food. So we were there from October until January, you guessed it, 1945. But during that time, we suffered. We suffered terribly. That's another thing that I have found out that a lot of survivors had in common. It was lack of food. It was constant hunger. So December 25, our third miracle, my grandfather, who was taken away, was able to escape, and he found us, and he was able to come into the ghetto. It was tremendous happiness, but a huge problem. One more mouth to feed. Now, during my presentation, I always make it a point to tell my young audience that I love women. Young, old, I love women. I think women are the stronger race, and my two incredible women proved it over and over. My grandmother at this stage had very little provisions left. We had a little canister of a flour container that had powder, not even. She made two tiny little biscuits, not bigger than the palm of my hand. And she wouldn't take a bite. When my mother begged her to share the food, she said, I can't. What am I going to tell my son? That I did not take care of you, or how I took care of you. So after, when my grandfather joined us, he didn't get too much food either. But this is something that only a mother can do. She sacrificed herself to make sure that Ibi and Andy get food because she wanted to tell her son that she took care of us. Little did we know that that son, the center of our universe, will never join us. So, next one. So this is how we had survived the ghetto. January 18, we are liberated. And this, in fact, is my second personal recollection. But as I said to you before, my mother had incredible talents. One of them is the ability to write. I'm going to read you a poem in which she describes my experience on January 18, 1945. It's a poem titled Hunger. Mommy, please give me a little bit of food. I am hungry, very hungry. Just this little, Mommy. My 2-year-old puts his two tiny fingers together, showing just how little he wanted. Tomorrow, my son, tomorrow, maybe the war will be over, and you will have all the bread you want. Hush, hush, little one, go to sleep. Don't cry. Mommy will hold you and sing you a lullaby. The next day comes and goes, but no food, only hopes. Hopes that tomorrow we could be free. The following morning, indeed, we hear noises, different voices. We all rush to the courtyard, and there he is, a Russian soldier who just liberated us. I beg him with sign language, with tears running on my cheek. Please give me some bread. My baby is starving to death. The soldier reaches into his pocket and puts a roll in my hand. As I give it to my child, he looks at it with wide, unbelieving eyes. Then crying and laughing and jumping with joy, he bites into the soft, beautiful white roll. It was dark, Russians did not have white bread. She just did a poetic license. That's my second personal recollection. And we're liberated. Now what? What's going to happen to us next? Next one, please. We try to pick up the pieces. This is a plaque commemorating the anniversary of the liberation when I was there with Judy in 2016. This was right after Israel. We went back to visit Hungary. And if we have time, I'll tell you a little bit about the specialty that happened in 2016. Actually, I can tell you right now, that is when this book was published. 2016, this book was published. And because of this book, I was able to reconnect with my childhood friend, Kati or Katie. This book is the combination of two books. And two books are something that I am very, very pleased with. The first one is called An Ordinary Woman in Extraordinary Times, written by my mother and used at York University for 10 years as text material. I can tell you how pleased I am that she was still alive when I was able to write a sequel to it and present it to her on my birthday. And the book is titled The Son of an Extraordinary Woman. The two books are combined into the one. And usually when I go out to schools, I give a presentation. But for today, for the first time ever, to my knowledge, this book is available online. And I'm sorry if I stole Emily's thunder, but this is an appropriate time because the Azrieli Foundation, who is specializing in commemorating and publishing Holocaust survivor stories, published this book in 2016. To this day, they have over 65 books published. Each and every one of them is an incredible story, but I believe that each and every one of them is a love story. Next one, please. Well, you saw the picture of that incredible man at age 31, second generation swimming instructor. Well, you're seeing the third generation swimming instructor, the only skinny one who can still hold his stomach in, unlike today, the one from the right in the middle. I was actually age champion at age 14 in butterfly and breaststroke, but my swimming career ended in 1956, the year this picture was taken, because that's when we came to Canada. However, I did teach swimming for 30 years, most of the time as a volunteer swimming instructor. I was one of the longest and oldest swimming instructor at the JCC, Jewish Community Center, before known as the YMHA. Next, please. So, my father. We went back for the first time in 1974. The entrance to the cemetery has an incredibly moving dedication. It says, "Hatred had killed them. May love cherish their memory." There it is, those two extremes, hate and love. In our Jewish tradition, at funerals, but every time we say that we remember them, Zahor, because as long as we remember them, they're with us. It is our tradition, it is obligation to remember them. So this is why it is so important. And I am so grateful to all my audiences, including you, that you have to honor my mother and my father. In fact, my whole family. Next. So we come to Canada, 1956, the borders open, the Hungarians have an uprising against the communist system, and a lot of people, mostly Jews, took the opportunity to leave the communist paradise and set for new life. we were able to come to Canada, interestingly enough, because of my swimming. Of course, everybody wanted to go to the United States, but the quota for the United States was quite long, a long wait. Canada took us right away. And because I wanted to be a swimmer, I was dreaming of being an Olympian. In my heart, I still am. I wanted to go to the States, but we settled for Canada. In 1958, my mother met a wonderful fellow survivor, Emil Grossman, who became our wonderful Papa Emil. My two children don't know any other grandparents because sadly, Maggie's parents, also survivors, were no longer alive before, they passed away before my kids were born. So you're looking at a bar mitzvah picture, since most of you know it, but for those who don't, bar mitzvah is a very special occasion in a Jewish life. During this presentation, what you're looking at is the entire remnants of their family. The one next to me was a first cousin to my father who came all the way from Israel for this celebration. And I met him for the first time. All my life, I was told that my father died of typhus, and I could not relate. I could not believe that a man with such physical condition could succumb to an ugly disease. So I met cousin Harry, first cousin to my father, for the first time at the bar mitzvah. And I asked him, were you together with my father? He said, yes. I said, how come that you were able to escape and he couldn't? And he looked me in the eye and he said, he didn't want to escape with me. Why? He said, Harry, you don't have a family. You don't have a wife. I have Ibi and Andy waiting for me. If we get caught, we'll be shot. Harry reluctantly left him, and he only got about 100 yards when he heard the machine gun. 27 young men, fathers, sons, brothers, murdered because they were Jews. These murderers did not have to do this. The war was over. They could hear the Russians approaching. That's why Harry escaped. But they were still murdering them. The hatred was so deep in their heart. So you can imagine my conflict. On the one hand, one of the happiest days of my life. On the other hand, the saddest news I could ever receive. I found out how he died. It took me a long time, a very long time, to sort it out and make peace that Zolti died because he loved. He died because he loved. I can't tell you how many times during my entire life, I had pictured how our lives would have been different. I had a wonderful stepfather. We had a wonderful relationship. But he was Ibi's husband, not my father. I was 16. By that time, it was too late for me to get a father. So he died because he loved. But we human beings are resilient. Life goes on. Next one, please. And I actually made peace with it. Now, life after liberation was difficult for a lot of people, but especially for those who lost loved ones. We were lucky, my mother and I, that we had a roof over our head. We continued living together with my grandparents, who spoiled me as much as they could, who gave me as much love as they could. But of course, they could not replace the one man that we all lost and mourned. So one of the things that my mother was incredible about, her forward-looking thinking in child raising. You have to remember, she was both father and mother to me. My grandfather was incredible, but it was my mother whose main responsibility was to raise me. So one of the things that happened after liberation, that we try to put our lives back together. So I don't think too many people can make the claim that I'm a biker because of my mother in the Holocaust. But I can because, well, not because I have a leather jacket, but because my mother at age 6 allowed me to ride a full-size adult motorcycle. And it happened at a amusement park, a very small amusement park that had as an attraction a ride 3 times around the ring. And when the carnival man saw that I was begging for my mother to let me on the bike, he comes over to her and says, if you let him on the bike, I'll only charge you half price. So my mother says, he's too little, his feet don't reach the ground. And the carny says, don't worry, we'll put him in the saddle and we'll catch him. All he has to do is pull the brake. So my mother relented. Believe it or not, at age 60, when I get my first brand new motorcycle, she couldn't remember this incident. And needless to say, that stayed with me until forever. At age 17, with my best friend, Mike Andrade, we bought 2 baskets of motorcycle parts, put it together, and we had one glorious motorcycle riding season until it turned out that half the parts were stolen and the shop wanted to repossess it, which they did. And according to my mother, it was one of the happiest days in her life when she saw the motorcycle dangling on the back of the tow truck. But nevertheless, I became a biker. Next. Next one. So I joined a Jewish motorcycle club, the Yowies, Y-O-W, Yidden on Wheels. And we have, ever since 2005, a Ride to Remember, R2R. Sadly, this was the year that my dear mother passed away. And I was on the organizing committee when my mother was getting progressively more ill. And I told her that I'm not going until she gets better. And the ride was to be in May. And she told me, I want you to go because by that time you will not have a mother. And I want you to go on this ride to remember me. And I did. And she was once again right. This is a poster that is in the Toronto Holocaust Center on the wall. And this is a picture of it. And I have this on my motorcycle every year on my Ride to Remember. I have had participated in all but 3 of them. Needless to say, this year it was canceled. But we're going back to Whitwell, Tennessee, the home of the Paperclip Project next year. Hopefully everything will be, and another project that you can all look up. So the motorcycle Ride to Remember came about. Now, there is a saying in motorcycle circles, there are only 2 kinds of riders. One who's already gone down the ground and kissed the ground, or one he's about to. So when I had the unpleasant task of clearing out my mother's apartment, I came across the necklace with the ring, and I decided to make a showpiece out of it. Because it's a big, heavy ring, I had not been able to use it under my riding glove. I put it into my breast pocket. So the law of physics is that if you don't keep your eye on the road and you do not look where you're going to crash. The law of physics is if you crash at 60 into a ditch, something will give, either the bike or the rider or both. But not this time, because I had the ring of love next to my heart. Now, we're going to wrap up in the next 3 minutes, I promise you. Next one. This is the poster that you can see on my bike in 2007. What you see, the Torah on a motorcycle Next to this Hell's Angel looking dude is a fully ordained rabbi, and there is a Holocaust era Torah that we use only during the Right to Remember. Next. This is one of the highlights of my motorcycle riding career, because I equate motorcycle to freedom, and I equate freedom to motorcycles. Easy. In 2012, I had the incredible honor to recite the pledge, and I'm going to ask each of you, even though you're at home, to please stand up and recite this pledge with me. This is what I said on the steps of Parliament Hill. My name is Andy Reti, a young child Holocaust survivor and a member of the Yao Motorcycle Club of Toronto. Less than 70 years ago, the world of 6 million Jewish people, including my own father, came to an end in an act that is so evil that the only word that can describe it is Holocaust. I stand before you as a free man to say, never again. Never again to any and all genocides. Never again to racial hatred. Never again to a second Holocaust. Please take this pledge by repeating it with me. We pledge to speak up against hatred and racism. We pledge to remember. Please put your hand over your heart and say, we pledge never again. Thank you. Now, I know that I was only given a certain amount of time. So Emily, do we have a few more minutes, or this is okay? We can wrap it up here.
We do have a couple more minutes, but I've got a couple of questions through. So I wanted to quickly see if you would be willing to answer a couple of those before we wrap up. Would that be okay with you?
You're in charge. You're my boss.
So one of the questions that we have, and of course, I absolutely love this because I know, especially as it's winter and it's COVID, a lot of people are looking for hope for the future. And I was wondering how you envisioned the future of Holocaust education. I mean, what gives you hope about the future?
Well, I am extremely optimistic, notwithstanding that we have a tremendous increase in anti-Semitism throughout the world, but at the same time, we have very positive steps. Interestingly enough, the virtual meeting is increasing our exposure exponentially. Usually when I go to a school, the audience can be as little, as few as 10 to maybe no more than 60. Today, we're reaching audiences in the hundreds, in the thousands. We also have the acceptance of the International Holocaust Society's definition of anti-Semitism. We also have Irvin Cutler, who's one of our most eloquent spokespeople. I know for a fact that we're working on getting Holocaust education to be introduced into the curriculum. And I can tell you from experience that a number of jurisdictions have it already, including Florida, where I do speak whenever I'm there. And next week, I actually will be talking to 300 kids in Florida via Zoom. So excellent question, and I am optimistic.
That's awesome. I love Florida. It's sad I'm not going to be going back this year, but that's amazing for those students, absolutely. And I think we have time for just one more question. And I think this is, again, sort of speaking to some of the younger people that are on this call. And I just am curious how you think your story and your mother's story, I mean, these lessons you go around and speaking to hundreds and hundreds of students, what sort of tangible, practical ways do you think they can act going forward? And sort of, I mean, live in honor and respect of your mother and you, because of course, that's sort of the goal of a lot of these workshops.
Forgive me, I'm going to give you a multi-part answer. At the beginning of my presentation, usually I ask children, how many of you told you that to your father or mother that I hate you? And usually a number of them will say, I put my hand up because I did. And then I will say, do you mean it? And of course, the answer is no. So now when we understand that hatred is not the same as a deep-rooted conviction, we can go forward. So the question is, how do we go forward? What is the positive outcome? The positive outcome is that we, as human beings, we're not the same, but we as human beings, we got to be tolerant of each other. We got to understand each other. We got to hear each other. Today, it is getting to the extreme that if you don't agree with me, I am going to beat you. That's not the answer. Listen to what you have to say. Listen to what I have to say. You don't have to beat each other up. You have to understand the meaning behind it. And really and truly, the Beatles said it best. Love conquers all. I am wearing a very special t-shirt. This was from Pittsburgh, where my motorcycle club went last year in a pride of reflection. This teacher says, hate and love. This is my message. This is what I believe in. Very good question. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. So I think we're just getting towards the end. So I wanted to, first of all, thank you so much, Andy. I know I've traveled with you and listened to the story probably a dozen times, and every single time I am always floored by how I always learn something else. So thank you. And I'm sure everyone else here feels the same. I'm going to quickly turn the conversation over to Michael, who I can see has his camera on, for a few closing remarks. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Emily. Thank you. Andy, that was so powerful. Thank you for taking us on that journey. And I'll tell you, particularly seeing the steps to Parliament Hill there that I used to climb pretty much every day, and hearing your never again pledge. I was standing here behind my desk doing that as you were saying it. So really powerful. And I think the way you've been able to get your message out so passionately, not just here this afternoon, but I know how much effort you put into this in so many different venues. And really, as we all know, as every single one of us knows on this Zoom today, more important than ever. So thank you for being here, for sharing your message, not just with us, but for so many of the people that you do share it with, especially students. It makes such a difference, sir, such a difference. Thank you.
It's my privilege.
Thank you.
So much,
I just want to thank, again, the team from the Wallenberg Centre that are partnering with us on this program. I had the opportunity to be online with Erwin earlier today. He is, as Andy mentioned, he's the new special envoy, and he's also our head of delegation to the IRA International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance plenary that's happening today in Leipzig, and I'm part of that delegation. So there's a lot of good work being done there, because we know more than ever, fighting back against the hate, against anti-Semitism, against the Holocaust denial that's happening around the world, and we're not immune in Canada. So voices like Andy's and Erwin's and so many of the people that are taking a stand, this is really, well, did I go? There I am. Okay, this is more important than ever. I also want to thank Emily from the Wiesenthal team, and Jordan and Elena and Melissa and Daniela, and our incredible team that works so hard, not just on this In Conversation program, but in schools and across the country every day, virtually now, but we know we're going to get that Tour for Humanity bus back on the road with our wonderful educators as soon as possible. And finally, to all of you that every 2 weeks are tuning in. Thank you so much. Like you know, we've been talking about this with the folks at Wallenberg. We're just amazed at how much interest there is. We're broadening the scope. We're going to be having other survivors of genocide coming to join us as well. And I also want to just remind you that we've got an event coming up with the renowned Nazi hunter, Dr. Effie Zuroff, on his book about the hidden Holocaust in Lithuania. That presentation is Sunday at 2 p.m. And if anybody is curious, wants to join that, please phone, email the office, and we'll make sure to get you the links to that program. We're co-sponsoring it with about, I think, 12 or 14 synagogues across the country. So with that, I'm going to turn everything back to Emily, but thank you again to you all.
Thank you so much, Michael. So I want to thank everyone for coming out this afternoon to listen and engage with our guest speaker. I especially want to thank everyone who tuned in from Hungary. I know that Andy had a hand in inviting everyone coming from across the Atlantic. So we're so happy that you were able to join us today. And of course, we're happy for all the locals as well who are here and have joined us every week. I want to finally take a second to remind everyone that our last speaker series event of the year will be taking place in 2 weeks on December 16th, and that will be with Mr. Gershon Willinger. Our conversation, like I said, December 16th at 4 p.m. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you so much again. Thank you, Andy, Michael, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.